This episode is brought to you by my Fertility Awareness Mastery online self-study program. Learn fertility awareness from the comfort of your own home at your own pace for a fraction of the cost. Head over to fertilityfriday.com/mastery for details. That's fertilityfriday.com/mastery. This is the Fertility Friday podcast, episode number 365. Welcome to the Fertility Friday podcast, your source for information about the fertility awareness method and all things fertility. I'm your host, Lisa Hendrickson-Jack. I'm the author of The Fifth Vital Sign and the Fertility Awareness Mastery Charting Journal. I'm a certified fertility awareness educator and holistic reproductive health practitioner with nearly 20 years of experience teaching women to connect to their fifth vital sign through menstrual cycle charting, balancing hormonal health, and optimizing the menstrual cycle without hormones. I'm outspoken about hormonal birth control and its impact on fertility and overall health because you have the right to know how your body works and how artificial hormones disrupt that natural process. I host live coaching programs to help you achieve optimal fertility and health because it's important to have healthy menstrual cycles regardless of whether or not you want to have babies. I'm also a wife and mother of two beautiful boys. I know, I'm a busy girl, but I managed to fit it all in. This podcast is designed to empower you to take full control of your cycles, your fertility, and your overall health. And I'm so excited that you're here with us today. Today I'm sharing a brand new episode in my Pill Reality series. This series has been just a really important part of the podcast. It's been a place where I've had the opportunity to really highlight the lived experiences of real women in the Fertility Friday community, my clients as well in the Fertility Awareness Reality series, and just provided the space to hear what women are saying about their own birth control methods. And I feel that this is extremely important. If we look at the stats, 50% of women come off of their birth control, their combined oral contraceptives. 50% of women stop taking it within a year because of side effects. So a lot of women are unhappy with the side effects associated with contraceptives. And to this day, most women who go on contraceptives really are not told about all the side effects. They may know about some of the major ones, but of course they don't think that it would apply to them. And certainly they're not necessarily told about the most common side effects, which are depression, anxiety, low libido, and other sexual side effects that a huge number of women experience. And so my hope for this series is that it really helps you to better understand the pill and the variety of side effects associated with it. But I hope that it also gives you pause when it comes to the overarching medical system. We should be asking some questions when it comes to how our medical system addresses a variety of medications. We should be asking why it is that most women who take hormonal contraceptives have never been fully counseled about all of the possible side effects, especially the most common side effects, including anxiety, depression, low libido, sexual side effects, painful sex. We should be really asking those questions. And why are the drug companies not being held accountable necessarily for that? Or why are the doctors not being held accountable for fully, advising and informing their patients? And so ultimately, this always comes back to the same thing, which is informed consent. And in order for us to have full informed consent, we must first listen to women when they share their personal experiences, when they tell you what their experiences were on birth control. And we shouldn't be telling them that, it's not scientific and it's just anecdotal and it doesn't matter. We should be listening because it's those anecdotal stories, those real women's experiences that ultimately build up and inevitably lead to the research that we actually need to verify everything. So with that said, let's go ahead and jump into today's episode. And I'm really excited to be here today with Christine. She's a member of the Fertility Friday community. And I'm really excited to have her share her story about birth control. I think you reached out to me a little while ago, and I felt compelled to invite you on the show. So welcome, Christine.
Thank you so much, Lisa. Yeah, as I mentioned, your show's been really empowering for me in my fertility journey, and even just understanding that fertility isn't necessarily getting pregnant, but it's just being aware of your menstruation and your period and empowering you to make decisions that really empower you.
Mm-hmm. It's so interesting that we learn about our cycles and our fertility in such a specific way, meaning kind of like if you're not actively trying to get pregnant right now, it kind of is irrelevant or it doesn't matter. It's so interesting. And it's also interesting and a bit sad that it's a novel concept that the menstrual cycle is a sign of health, and that being fertile and healthy is just a part of being in a female body. So side note, I'm totally with you there.
Yeah, for sure.
Well, and so I would love to start just by kind of going back to tell us a little bit about how old you were when you first started menstruating and how you managed your fertility, what that was all like, and if you've used hormonal contraceptives before.
Yeah. So my first experience with getting my period, I was 13, which at the time was pretty late. I understand now that it's quite an average time, but at the time, I mean, most of my friends have already had their period. So I felt like I was like, finally, like, oh my gosh, this is a huge moment for me. And the discussion, I never really remember talking too much about my period and menstruation before actually getting my period with my parents or with my mom. But I knew that it was something that wasn't scary. And I never had that scary situation where I got my period and was like, oh my gosh, this is really scary. I'm bleeding. I totally was relaxed. It was funny. I was coming out of a bookstore and I came out of the bookstore using the washroom, and it was my dad who was with me. And I was like, Dad, I just got my period. We were all like, woo, like that's awesome. And it was kind of a celebration for me. So the whole experience was really positive. And once I did get my period, there was no discussion around contraceptives at that point. I knew that when I became 15 and I was into high school, a lot of my friends had been on the pill or about to start the pill. And again, everyone else was kind of in that situation. So I thought that being on the pill was kind of a rite of passage. So I really felt like going on the pill was going to be something really positive for me. Everyone else was doing it. I was really excited to kind of take that next step. It felt like the next step in getting your period was going on the pill or taking that, that step. So I remember going to my mom and being like, Mom, like I've had my period for a couple of years now. My friends are going on the pill. I really want to go on the pill. And she was like, okay, Christine, why do you want to go on the pill? And I was like, she's like, are you having sex? I was like, no, but I feel like I want to do it. All my friends are doing it. It sounds great. No period, no acne. And it was just a flat out no. It was a no. And it was a good response looking back. But at the time I felt like, again, I was missing out. Everyone was on the pill. I wanted to join the club. It really did feel like a club. And yeah, it was a no from there. And I just remember, even though that wasn't a part of my life, taking the pill at that point, I remember that the discussion around my period and around what I was experiencing was really open. I grew up in a very free discussion kind of conversation family where we could all talk about things. I could share with my cousins what I was going through with my period, or, what to expect when you were having intercourse and how to protect yourself. So the discussion was really open, and I felt really comfortable with my period. And when I was going to have intercourse for the first time, I felt comfortable knowing that I knew what to do, because it wasn't such a taboo topic in my family and within my family, I guess. I also think that, my mom's decision to tell me to not take the pill was really coming from her past. My parents both have a very holistic view of taking care of me and my sister. They were they didn't grow up around medications. It could have been a cost thing. They're both from different countries. Neither of them were born in Canada. And I think that they grew up, it could have been a cost thing, but they grew up, not really having access to a lot of these medications and pills that we have access to here so easily. So I think that it was never a consideration for them to put, their daughter who was 14, 15 on the pill right away. It wasn't normalized for them. So I think when it came to us, they were very cautious with medications in general, especially the pill, especially something that wasn't necessary. And the whole approach was, if my period was heavy, it was, Christine, you need to take iron because you're probably losing a lot of blood and that's why you have low energy, and if it was for acne, it was, let's go see a dermatologist, or maybe it's the sugar. So my parents really had that approach. So it wasn't just, let's do something to help her quick. It was, let's figure out what's going on and support her until, her period balances out and it's not so heavy or disturbing for her. And I really feel like, looking back, that was a really good call on my parents' end. I think it's funny that a 15-year-old went up to them and was like, I want to be on the pill. And they're like, okay, are you having sex? But yeah, so that was kind of my experience in my youth, pre-intercourse. Post-intercourse, I think, was different. I got into a long-term relationship and decided that it was time to start looking into something that would protect me from pregnancy, because I didn't feel like I wanted to get pregnant and I wouldn't be comfortable with it happening. And the first thing that I looked into that my mom used was the IUD. And I feel like the IUD was kind of the only option for me, because the whole concept of putting hormones in my body was a no from the get-go. But I didn't really understand, I guess, how the IUD would still affect me, even though there's no hormones involved. And I feel like I was unaware. I mean, I went into it with really low iron to begin with. And the Copper IUD really, it can increase your period. It can increase the amount of blood you lose. Your period lasts a little bit longer. So for me, who's someone who's already really low in iron, to add in an extra 3 days of bleeding was not good for me. I was fainting. I was really tired. I was lethargic. Even though, my doctor was well aware of being low in iron, it was an important decision for me to be on some sort of contraceptive, I think, or some sort of birth control. And so it wasn't great for me. And during that time, I developed an ovarian cyst. So from there, it was kind of just figuring out, what is this pain on my side? Where is it coming from? And what can I do? And I think the process of finding out what is going on with you can be so stressful, because you're waiting months, sometimes more than weeks, sometimes months in between ultrasounds and before you get these tests and before you get these answers. So it's a pretty stressful time. And I feel like it was really, I was kind of left in the dark about a lot of things. So I remember asking for an ultrasound the first time, being told that, wait a few months, like you're probably fine, it's okay. And then going back and persisting and kind of having to say, it's really, really painful now, and I really want to check this out. And I finally went for the ultrasound, and it was simply, you should be on the pill, and that'll clear it up right away. And there's, that's the answer there. And I remember thinking to myself, that's really not what I want to hear, because after all of this and going through getting this IUD, it's not a fun process. It's not easy at all. And it's definitely not comfortable. To just be told to take the pill again was a little bit frustrating. And that's kind of when I hit the web, as a lot of people do when they feel like they don't have answers or they're left so unclear. And I did research into the cyst and things that could be making it worse and things that could be making it better. And I'm unclear if it was the IUD that resulted in that change, because there are no hormones in this Copper IUD. It's still obviously a destruction to that area and a disturbance to that area, I guess. But yeah.
I pause you. So, because we'll get to this, the kind of next stage.
Yeah.
But I want to hang out here and ask you a couple of questions. So I haven't extensively studied the link between, say, the Copper IUD and ovarian cyst, but I do know that it's a thing. And certainly you're not the first person that I've spoken to who, it's kind of one of those things where you're literally doing all of your research. You're purposely trying to avoid the hormones because you're trying to avoid the side effects and all the, potential unknowns with being on hormones and all those things, only to discover that there's side effects with, anything really, any kind of foreign body. Like in this case, it's like a medical device. But But yeah, so just to put it out there, especially for anyone who's listening as well, who may have had a similar experience. So certainly it's not uncommon, and it is one of the potential side effects. Obviously, all women don't experience ovarian cysts when they use a copper IUD, but it is an actual thing. Meaning the copper IUD itself is somehow irritating. One thing I wanted to ask you though, could you describe what it was like? So in terms of the pain, the frequency, like what it actually felt like, was it always on the same side? Like what was this experience of having these cysts?
Absolutely. It was, like I said, before I actually knew what it was really scary, because when you Google these symptoms, the worst thing comes up and then you can't focus on your day. You're really scared. So I think that understanding kind of what exactly I was feeling when it was coming up. So pain during intercourse, absolutely. Pain on the one side, for me, it was the left side, was a sign for sure that something was up, because I hadn't experienced pain before. And it started to become something that happened when I was even exercising. So running, exercise from jumping, and at some point it was even walking, I would feel it. So at that point, I guess the cyst had gotten big enough that it was something that we can feel. And I think that a lot of people don't know that our ovaries produce these tiny cysts on a regular basis every time we menstruate. But when they stick and grow like that, that's obviously something to be concerned about. Usually, they would dissolve on their own, but this one got pretty big, and for sure it was painful.
So on a separate note, because you kind of mentioned just in your story in general that, if you had a period that was heavy, your parents would talk to you about, iron and things like that. So were your periods heavy before, just generally speaking? And did you have any pain, or were they just kind of heavy in terms of volume before the IUD?
Before the IUD, I never had painful periods. I never had cramps, but I did have just generally really heavy periods that lasted a long time. But my mom's approach was that I had something similar, and with time, as your body adjusts to having a period, it will lessen, it will lighten up, and that'll happen over time. So I always had that in the back of my head. I always knew that it wasn't going to last that long forever, and that it was just a process of my body transitioning to this new stage.
Okay. Yeah, no, that's interesting. But you still had found yourself in a situation even before the IUD where your iron was a little bit low and you thought it could be related to the periods. And so you mentioned that your periods were 3 days longer. So would you just take us through kind of, I always think of the women who are listening who, because one thing about heavy periods in general is that the only period you really experience is your own, unless you have a job like I do and you're always, being nosy, asking all these questions for good reason. But a lot of women who have really heavy periods don't realize how heavy. So certainly when I talk about this in my group programs and I do like a little demo and things like that, I'll often get women who will kind of be like, wow, like it's possible for women not to bleed that little, when I show them kind of like the lower end of normal. And then the women on the lighter end of normal are kind of like, what? People bleed that much? So if you were to just give us a general, like, and like whether it's like if you use a cup or, tampons or pads, like how many you were going through and like the difference once you went on the IUD.
Yeah. So I went from pretty balanced periods before 5 to 7 days, which I guess is a little on the heavy end, but it wasn't disturbing my day. I went from that to a period that lasted up to 9 days on most cycles. So every day, for the first 5 days, maybe filling 2 cups. Before that, it was several really heavy pads. So just, and nothing was keeping this blood in. Like it was like, even if I used a tampon and a pad, it would still somehow get through. And I'd be worried about it all the time. Like, is it on the chair? Do I have to worry about it, leaking? And so on top of it actually being physically stressful on my body, it was mentally really stressful too. And it would make it kind of hard to focus on my workday.
Yeah, that sounds pretty significant, especially if you're feeling about 2 cups every day for 5 days. There are some women who are listening who maybe fill 1 or 2 cups their whole period.
Wow.
So exactly. Women who bleed heavy can't even imagine what that would be like.
Yeah.
So
and not to mention, like, I was really low iron too, right? Like this whole time I was already low iron, and then to go into it and add these extra days of bleeding, it was like I could barely keep my eyes open.
Well, and there's this interesting relationship, women who have low iron bleed more. It's one of those correlation, is it causing it or whatever is going on? But women with really heavy bleeding often have low iron, and low iron, can contribute to heavy bleeding potentially. So you're kind of in that type of situation. And just for anyone who's listening, certainly if you are relating to this and you do bleed on the heavy side pretty regularly, it is a good idea as a general kind of regular checkup. If you go to your doctor once a year or whatever to get your iron levels tested, your ferritin stores, because if you do bleed heavy, that's something that you should be looking at. And certainly I talk about liver on the podcast all the time. That is one way of naturally increasing your iron stores. And obviously it's food, so it's not as hard on your stomach as certain supplements. So I'm just kind of inserting this in there. And of course, I have a history of heavy bleeds as well, with my history of fibroids as well. And so certainly I have a lot of empathy for that. And so there was another question I wanted to ask, because every time I interview someone who has used the IUD, could you tell us about the insertion? Was it okay? Was it painful? How did that go?
The insertion it's a pretty funny story actually, because I remember going and telling my sister and I we'll typically do those things together. Even if we're with a boyfriend, it'll be like me and her attacking this. I let her know that I was going to get it inserted. She's 5 years younger than me. So she came with me. I was at this point with the Copper IUD, I was 22 and I think she was just 18 or something like that. And she came with me, and she actually came into the room with me. Here in Canada, I had to go get the IUD from a drugstore and then bring it to the doctor. She didn't have them there. It was kind of approached in a way, it'll be 5 minutes, it'll be super quick. I didn't take any painkillers or anything like that before. And it was weird. It was a weird experience. It was inserted pretty quick, but the pain was, for me, pretty excruciating with the copper. From what I hear and from what I'm told, it's one of the bigger IUDs that you can get. So it's typically something that they don't even really put in women who haven't had kids, because their cervix is so small pre-birth. So it was something that was really excruciating for me. And I just remember seeing my sister's face, and she went really pale and looked like she was about to faint. And same for me right after, just with the kind of pain and the bleeding, of course. So yeah, it wasn't great.
Well, and so I'm going to dig into that a little bit more. So I've heard some women who've, talked about this on the podcast have described like it was like a shooting pain once, and then it kind of went away. Some women described kind of having cramping throughout the day or the next day or the next couple of days. So, first of all, on a scale of 0, so no pain, you're laying on a beach and it's wonderful, 10, someone's like drilling a nail into you or something. How would you place it? And then was it kind of like just for a moment, or did the pain last for a period of time?
It was a strong 6 to 7, I'd say, maybe even a 7 for me, just because the pain was where I experienced the pain just felt really unexpected. It was kind of catching me off guard. And I think that kind of made it worse. And of course, the next day was really, really painful. I was constantly feeling dizzy from the pain, taking several Advils, and then that pain kind of lasted throughout the next week and a half. And then every time I got my periods were suddenly painful. And I think that was something for me that was really shocking, because I had never had an experience with cramps. So I finally started experiencing what these really like intense contractions felt like. And they were really debilitating for me, because I hadn't experienced a cramp before. Yeah.
Wow. So I'm like, so you then for the next week and a half or more were experiencing these cramps throughout the day. And those out of 0 to 10, how would you rate
like
those?
A strong 6, I'd say.
That's really, and then you mentioned there was bleeding as well. So yeah, so for everyone who's listening to the episode, certainly I've in the Pill Reality series, so fertilityfriday.com/pill reality. I don't know how many episodes there are in the series now, but probably somewhere between 20 and 30 or more. But there are a few episodes specifically where we address the IUD and in all of these episodes, I just learned along the way to start asking about the insertion because it's not always volunteered like today. And I wasn't really aware, I would say, before I started doing these interviews about how common this whole pain thing is. So every single woman I interviewed didn't have pain, but the majority did. And it sounds like it's very severe, but I haven't really heard an experience like yours yet that I can think of, meaning that the pain, because I've heard women describe it as like painful and then having some kind of mild cramping or, but for you, it sounds like it was really, really severe, but it also continued. And so it's kind of like so for anyone who's listening, who's thinking about getting an IUD or anything like that, it's important to know, because it doesn't seem like most doctors will advise you of this, but it is actually possible to have a painkiller administered. Of course, it may not sound like the greatest thing in the world to have potentially a needle in the cervix to numb the area, but certainly this is something you can ask your doctor about. And I think that it's really unfortunate. I've heard people say these strange things, like some doctors don't think we have nerve endings in there, and so they don't believe that it could be painful. And for the record, the cervix plays a really important role in the orgasm reflex and things like that. And certainly women who've experienced damage to the cervix, some do go on to have difficulty achieving orgasm and experiencing additional pain. So this is a pretty significant thing. Yeah. Even if it's not significant to your practitioner, it's significant to you. So it's like public service announcement. You can actually get a painkiller if you're getting an IUD inserted in it. From what I've heard directly from the mouths of women who've had their IUDs inserted, is that it would be actually warranted as a standard for the doctor to offer painkillers.
Yeah.
Instead of dismissing it and saying, oh, it's just going to be a minute. It's going to be totally fine.
Yeah. And maybe that's the case for someone else, or maybe that would have been the case for someone who had a child before and their cervix was in a different condition than mine was. But for me, it was really, really painful. And the fact that I went from having no cramps to having these really long periods that involved really heavy cramps was a total lifestyle change for me and what I was used to. And I think no one really is prepared for that either, for how that's going to change, the way you do sports or if you can do physical activity when you're in your period anymore. All these things kind of change as well.
Well, and to this day, do you still, we'll get into that part because I think you have a different IUD now, potentially. Mm-hmm. But yeah, so share with us then, if this has changed. I think we were at the turning point of your story before I kind of jumped in with all these questions. So maybe we can go back. So you have the IUD, you've had the Copper IUD, you've had it in for a while, you're having cysts, you're having these heavy periods that are also now painful, and you're kind of getting to the end of your rope with this stuff.
Yeah. So it was the exhaustion every time I would have my period, and even not having my period just became too much for me. I felt like this wasn't a normal way to live, especially since I didn't really live like that before. It had just made my low iron something that became anemia, and anemia is extremely low iron and red blood cell count and all those things. So for me, it was just like taking my exhaustion to another level, and even, my sugar cravings and things that I needed to get my energy up became more intense, which changed my eating habits. So starting to look into ways to see if I could naturally control or at least reduce the size of this cyst was really important to me. And I looked into, the correlation between sugar and hormone imbalance, and how a lot of hormonal imbalances can attribute to some of these cysts that people grow, whether it's through high testosterone levels or, insulin resistance is common with people with PCOS or cysts as well. So maybe my body wasn't reacting well to a lot of the sugars that I was consuming to try and bring my energy up with this low energy I was struggling with. So I think that was the first thing for me, was seeing what can I do here. And I had a follow-up ultrasound, because when you get this cyst, they want to see in 3 months, they want to see if it's grown or reduced in size. And then they would know that maybe it's something to be super worried about. So in that time, I was obviously really worried and tried to do everything I can. So really removing sugar, being really careful with sugar, refined sugar, and increasing the amount of cruciferous vegetables and fiber and all these things that would really help me remove some of this excess, hormone or sugar in my body, and just eating well overall. And then I went back for the ultrasound, and the cyst was pretty much gone. So that was a great sign. but I was still really struggling with this low energy, heavy period situation. And like I said, at that point, it was really interfering with my ability to even go out like on the heavier days or do sports. So for me, it was time for a change. My iron levels were consistently low. I was getting blood work every 3 months as well. And so when I discussed with my doctor a change, she again told me that the pill would be the best option for me and my iron. I told her I didn't want the pill, and there was no exceptions. That was just not an option for me. I never grew up thinking that it was an okay thing to take. So for me, it was like an absolute no. So I ended up choosing the Mirena IUD to switch over to. The reason for that was I had spoken with other women, and my mom included, who had had okay experiences with it. And I was ready to make the change. When I went to take the IUD out, she said, I said, can you take it out and maybe I can have a few days without an IUD and kind of just feel how I feel without anything. And she did tell me that it wasn't a good idea just in case I got pregnant in those few days and that it could happen really quickly. My partner wasn't even in the country. So
condoms don't exist. I'm just curious.
Yeah. And so she was very, very persistent in saying, I don't want to take it out until you have the decision to go with the Mirena, with the new IUD, and we'll do the swap right away. It's just, she said, most women won't even come back for the second IUD, or they'll get pregnant in between and they don't want to. So to avoid all risks, let's get the other IUD in right away. So I didn't really get a chance to be without an IUD in between, and I got the new one right away.
Yeah. I mean, that's really, it's interesting. I mean, from the interviews that I've done with doctors, that seems pretty in alignment with how they're trained, because certainly there is, unfortunately, this idea these days. I've talked about this on the podcast a bit, but nowadays it's like, so when I was coming out of, high school back in the 2000s, the early 2000s, there wasn't the same push that if you weren't on hormonal contraceptives, that it's the same as not being on anything. So it's to me, it's a very interesting idea that as a doctor, you feel like a grown woman is incapable of using a barrier method for a period of time. That is a very interesting idea.
Yeah.
And also that kind of like you're saying, I would rather do it this way. And the doctor's saying, no, this is the better way. And of course, it's a recommendation. That's your doctor's opinion from her experience. And I'm not saying there isn't validity to that, she probably has had patients who did come off the IUD and didn't come back or did get pregnant and on all of those things. And we don't know the circumstances, maybe she wanted to get pregnant but again, maybe it would have been a different scenario if she had been counseled on barrier method usage, right? So yeah, who knows? But how did you feel about that? Because the way when you said it, you kind of were like, I didn't have the opportunity to be without it. And now I have this new one and it was right away. And it seemed like, it wasn't exactly how you had imagined it. So, did it work out for the best, or how is it going now?
Yeah, I was pretty excited at the idea of not having anything in my uterus for a quick minute and just being with myself. And I think when you get something like that foreign put in your body, it's so much of a physical experience, but it's also really like an emotional experience, because now you know that your little uterus isn't just your little uterus. It's got something inside of there, and you're so conscious of that. So I was pretty excited to just give it a break. But when I got the new IUD, it was a game changer for me as someone who had low iron and suddenly wasn't bleeding, at all now at this point. So I went from having really heavy periods to essentially no periods with maybe light spotting, and my energy levels are so much better and I feel better. But at this point right now, and it's been a great method for me, and my experience has been really positive, and I'm so lucky because I know a lot of women don't have positive experiences with it. But I'm at the point now that I've had it for a few years that I think it's a 5-year IUD, and I'm at 2 years now, and I feel really disconnected from the fact that I don't have my period anymore.
I wanted to pop in with a quick message from today's sponsor, Audible.
Did you know that you can listen to The Fifth Vital Sign for free when you sign up for a 30-day trial with Audible? Head over to fertilityfriday.com/audible for details. That's fertilityfriday.com/audible. Now let's jump back into today's episode.
So I feel disconnected from myself. I feel disconnected from my fertility. We learn so much on your show, and we learn a lot now that, a healthy period is a sign of good health in general. And it doesn't have to be that you're ready to have a baby, but it can mean so many things. It can mean you're treating your body right, you're eating right, you're moving your body right. And I think that to not be able to see what's going on with me in that physical way has been a little bit, like I said, feeling disconnected from myself. And even when it comes to moods or when I get emotional, because, you still ovulate with this IUD. So, and I guess the way that it was explained to me was that, the hormones are very small. They're still there, but they're also localized, I guess, and they don't run through the bloodstream, which doesn't really make sense because
you can see my face. This is the point where I interject. And
I know.
Public service announcement, right?
Right.
So
yeah.
This is really interesting because there must be a pamphlet that goes that the drug companies send over to all the physicians, because they all say the same thing. They all say the same. It's the exact
same line. Mm-hmm.
So they all say it's low hormones. It's a low dose. It's only localized. It just stays in your uterus. The irony is that if you have hand lotion that has perfume in it and you put it on your skin, those xenoestrogenic chemicals can actually go through your bloodstream from if you have lotion on your arm and disrupt your menstrual cycle. So there's no such thing as localized hormones in an IUD. The only thing that it could possibly mean is that they are in your body and they're releasing from that local area.
Right.
So for the record, we have a circulatory system. And so when you have the IUD inserted, the progestins do not stay in the uterus. That's absurd. Mm-hmm. They go into the bloodstream and they circulate throughout your entire body, just to be clear. And I appreciate that. And you're not alone in this. I'm not singling you out at all.
No, absolutely.
Because I hear this all the time and it irritates me.
Yeah.
So even, they could argue that it's like a lower dose. And I feel like there's really creative language used around all types of medication, but ultimately it's enough to prevent you from conceiving. And so with the hormonal IUDs, they are progestin releasing. So all the different brands. So it's not progesterone, like the same hormone, it's a synthetic version. Right. And the main mode of action is to prevent the development of a full endometrial lining. So the endometrial lining typically does become quite thin. And so, as you mentioned, so there's a range. So some women will experience irregular bleeding from the beginning. So some women will actually experience a lot of bleeding and spotting that kind of goes on. So some women actually experience a lot of bleeding for even the first 3 to 6 months, but that typically subsides for most women.
Right.
And so it's a challenge because if you have that, it's obviously who wants to bleed all the time, and you go to your doctor and they say, okay, it's normal, right? And, it usually, according to the research, usually does subside if that's by about the 6-month mark. Just to your point with regards to ovulation. So as far as the progestin releasing IUDs go, certainly, again, on that pamphlet that the doctors read from, they say, oh yeah, you get to keep ovulating and everything's fine. Mm-hmm. And so it's helpful to know that there are kind of 3 categories that you may fall into. So one category is that you may actually ovulate regularly, similar to just a regular cycle. Another is that you may continue to ovulate, but it'll be more sporadically. And certainly it can change over time. So if you're ovulating consistently at the beginning, or by year 4, you may not be, or vice versa. And then, so it's helpful to realize that not every woman is going to be ovulating really regularly with the hormonal IUD, although some will. Absolutely. So that's just the public service announcement that I wanted to put in there, because I think it's important for us to just understand the complexity of these things instead of being told something that is kind of half true sometimes.
Absolutely. And I feel like it totally makes sense, because when you do read these pamphlets, which honestly, if you're not someone who's a doctor or in the science community, you're not really going to understand what a lot of these progesterone is. And unfortunately, a lot of doctors don't have the time to sit and explain this to you. So you're left with a pamphlet that doesn't really make sense, but you're told by a doctor that, no, you won't, you'll ovulate and it'll just be a tiny bit of hormones. So of course you're going to go, okay, all right.
That sounds like the greatest thing ever. I guess right? It's ovulating. It's not very much hormone.
Exactly. And they give you this pamphlet that doesn't really make sense. So, but it does say, it's interesting because it does say, side effects can be acne, side effects can be weight fluctuations. So if these hormones were localized, a lot of these total body side effects wouldn't be happening, right?
Well, isn't that interesting? That's an excellent observation. I'm just going to pause on that for a moment because yes, if what they're saying is true and it is localized, how could it say on the insert, that's mandated, that they had to do research and they're legally required to put on the insert what they found in their own trials about what this does to people. And so for everyone listening, drug inserts are just fascinating things to read, honestly. And if you've never read a drug insert related to hormonal contraceptives, pick your favorite brand and search it now, because you will be fascinated to see what it says on there. And certainly it doesn't say in the Mirena Skyla, right? That it only uterine side effects.
Never. Yeah. That's would never say that. Yeah. And I think that even going to, towards all types of birth control, like we were saying, a lot of women don't know how to translate this medical language. And when you don't really know what's going on and you can't understand this insert that you're given in 2 minutes, is that an empowered decision when you're making the decision to choose one of these birth controls? Because an empowered decision, to me is knowing what you're choosing and really being strong in that. But is it empowering to make that decision when you don't really know and when you are kind of left in the dark?
Yes, exactly. But the good news is that in your case, you actually had a positive experience, and you're still having currently a positive experience with the Mirena, and especially coming off of the negative experience that you had with the Copper IUD. Certainly that must have been a huge relief for you. So, and it's kind of like this interesting double-edged sword, because of course, wow, I don't bleed anymore. And obviously that's helpful when you're trying to kind of restore those normal iron levels. But at the same time, you're also at the point where you're kind of like, this is great, but maybe not forever.
No, definitely. And like I was saying, it really is. It's funny that you don't really think about that, but when you no longer are menstruating, you really do feel this sense of disconnect. And it makes sense because our bodies are meant to menstruate. And when that's no longer a part of your cycle, your 28 days, it's pretty strange. It's pretty foreign. And I didn't really expect to feel that way.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Well, so, you have some time to think about this and simmer and certainly I say this, I suppose, here and there, but certainly I come across as very anti-pill and anti-hormones because I'm always talking about it, and that's okay. Everyone's entitled to their perspective, but I still think it's important because what this podcast has allowed me to do is to just provide a platform so we can have conversations like this one. And what I know from all of my client work and connecting with people, who listen various ways, is that the women who listen to these episodes really value them and find it to be kind of like a place where you can find, where can you find these conversations? So even if you sent your girlfriend or your sister to this episode to listen, your sister maybe might know all the details because she's literally there. But typically speaking, your girlfriends may not have ever heard the full story and had all the details. So even our closest friends, we don't necessarily have these conversations with, and so this is basically the point. And the point is to know, from my perspective, to know what these things are really doing. I think there's this kind of this paternal nonsense happening in medicine where we can't scare the patients off, right? If I take it out and I don't put the other one in right away, you won't come back.
Yeah, she'll be pregnant in a day.
So I need to be your parent figure and make the decision for you and tell you what's best for you because I know better than you do, right? Exactly. So there's this whole, and if we tell her all the side effects, because I literally quoted a research study exactly like this in the pill chapter of the book, but it's literally like, if we tell them all the side effects, then they'll know and they might not want to go on the medication. So we can't tell them. Yeah. How are we going to find a way to communicate this to them? So this is nonsense. At the end of the the day, I actually had a really interesting conversation a couple of days ago. And I get this sometimes, right? The response, because I'm not 100% like anti-pill. Mm-hmm. And I understand. I mean, I took the pill. How could I be all like, no, when I actually took it for a reason. And when I took it for period pain when I was in high school. And at the end of the day, those fake pill periods were pretty painless. So it kind of did what I was looking for at the time. Mm-hmm. So I had this conversation with a woman, and she was kind of like, how could you ever? Because she was kind of like, don't you think women just should never use it? How could you ever say, right? And I understand that perspective as well. You know, there was probably a time in my raging 20s where I was super pissed, right, all the time until I found an outlet. Right. So I feel like I've been through all the stages, but what I always say, because what I said to her is, well, yeah, well, people smoke and they drink alcohol, and you know, now in Canada, right, there's always a line in front of the pot store. So like,
100%, the biggest line,
right? Yeah, always. It's like it's consistently been there since it's opened.
9 a.m. sharp.
It's there. So like people do all kinds of things, and who am I to say don't smoke or don't? I mean, obvious. And the thing too is like, and this is I will die on this hill. Like this is one of the many, but I mean, honestly, the point that the role that I see of having these conversations is just to really get in there. Like, so what is it doing? What's it really like? What is that experience like? Mm-hmm. And then knowing that you can, so for example, you know, we talked about your pretty horrific experience of insertion. Mm-hmm. So if a woman
traumatic for myself and for my sister,
correct, and the listeners and myself, but the purpose of you sharing that story is obviously not to say no one should ever like that's not the purpose. The purpose of it is to say many women experience insertion pain. And so if you are actually thinking about getting an IUD, you should know that and also know a few options. So knowing that you can have a conversation with your doctor and actually request pain medication, that's a useful piece of information if you choose to get an IUD. Now, some women are going to hear that and be like, oh my gosh, never. And that's okay too. And that's the whole point of this conversation. And similar, you already know that I've interviewed women who've also used the Mirena and had a different type of experience on it than you did. And again, the purpose of these conversations isn't to say, don't use the Mirena or use the Mirena. It's to say like, hi, I'm Christine. This is my experience on the Mirena. And then this just helps us all to make informed choices. And I hope that that's what comes through because, yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, I really am at the point where one other thing that came to mind too is that now that you're on it, even though you have no side effects that you are aware of, your experience is really positive, you're still kind of thinking about, you know, how long do I want to be on this thing? And that is the point. The point is for us to always be just making those decisions, deciding what's best for us for whatever reason.
And that's empowering. You know, we do have access to all these forms of birth control and that's so great because women can make these decisions. But I mean, like we were saying, it's not empowering when you're not informed. And I think these kinds of discussions make women feel empowered because then they have these experiences to make their decisions. Mm-hmm.
Well, and I've had so many conversations over the years, as you know, many of them publicly, right, on the podcast, but more than you've heard on the podcast, I've had privately. You know, I've been involved in this world since I was about 18 years old. I have friends, I'm a woman, and I've had all kinds of relationships throughout my life. And so I've seen how all of these different methods can affect women in different ways. And yeah, I mean, ultimately, I was going somewhere with this. I just feel like there's a lot of pressure on us to do things in a certain way. And certainly there's also a lack of accurate and complete information. And it's a constant challenge and struggle for us to be able to do this. And the podcast isn't necessarily the be all and end all, but hopefully it provides that kind of like segue into like, oh, wow, there's more to this. And hopefully it'll encourage you to start actually looking into it. Because for what it's worth, the vast majority of women on the pill have never read the insert for the drug that they're on.
And that's scary because that's a decision that you're making, but it's not an empowered decision when you don't know.
Exactly. Well, so as we wrap up, first of all, thank you so much for coming on the show and sharing your story and being so open and candid and patient with all of my nitty-gritty questions. But of course, I ask because we want to know, right? Because this is how we can prepare ourselves for whatever decisions that we make. For someone who's listening, who tuned in because they're thinking about getting an IUD, or because maybe they've actually been experiencing some of the things that you have, and they're wondering if it could have been related, what, if anything, would you want them to know?
I would say tune into your periods and be persistent with things like ultrasounds. If you feel like something's wrong, I had to persist on 2 separate visits for an ultrasound, and I wouldn't have known if I had a cyst if I didn't. So if you feel like something's wrong, be your biggest health advocate. No one will look out for you like you. Doctors are busy too. They have 5 minutes to spare with you. So be persistent in that if you feel like something's wrong. And I would say, I wouldn't tell people that getting an IUD is going to fix some of the issues that maybe they were having. So for example, getting the Mirena is going to give you a lighter period, because I am well aware that the period that I go into getting the IUD with is likely going to be the period that I come out of getting the IUD with if I don't make changes to make it lighter or to improve my symptoms. So I think that knowing that the IUD, or in general hormonal birth control, isn't going to fix your issues that you're having with your fertility and with your menstruation is really important as well. And then it's so much more than that. Sometimes it's tweaking your diet, it's exercise, it's removing some of the stress in your life. So I think that knowing that you do have a lot of control over your experience with your fertility and your menstruation is really important.
Mm-hmm. And that's a really good point, because you still have the kind of unknown, because you didn't get the period in between. So you have the unknown of what happens when I have it out. And so certainly that's probably one of the big factors kind of hanging over your head, because you don't know, is it going to be like it was when I was on using the Copper IUD? It's going to be better. Did the procedure make it worse? Right. So these are all the unknowns. And so I think that's a really good point. And so I suppose we'll end on that note, the kind of question mark. Thank you so much for being on the show. This was really informative, and I'm excited to share it.
Thank you so much, Lisa, for your time.
Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed today's show, please share it with a friend. You'll find the show notes page for today's episode over at fertilityfriday.com/365. I hope that you enjoyed today's episode with Christine. These episodes always really, really tug at my heartstrings. There's so many women that have experienced such a variety of different side effects and reactions when using birth control. And it's such a divisive topic. Women who have never experienced negative side effects are often the ones jumping in saying that I was fine. You're out there talking about all these negative side effects. You're fear mongering, right? You're telling women all these things, making them afraid to take it, when really it's totally fine. And then on the other hand, you have women who've experienced moderate to severe side effects or life-altering side effects, things that really actually did make a difference in their day-to-day lives. Certainly some of the interviews that I've shared are with women who've had life-threatening side effects. And so I think that these conversations are really important, because it really does highlight a few specific things. One of the things that highlights is that we're not all the same. And so one medication can be completely fine for one person and not really cause a lot of side effects that they're noticing. And the exact same medication can completely destroy another person, depending on their own kind of bio-individuality. And we don't always know who is going to have a good experience and who is going to have a negative experience. And so it's really important to recognize the complexities when it comes to medical side effects, when it comes to how drugs interact with an individual and how they interact with each other. And certainly having that openness to different experiences, because certainly one of the criticisms that I've had is, well, you're just showcasing women who've had side effects. Well, these are all real women who have told me their stories. And certainly the majority of my clients have used birth control and they share their experiences with them. And certainly most of the time it is not life-threatening. It falls on a spectrum of, mild, moderate to severe. But ultimately, I always feel that it's very, very important for us to listen to these experiences, because there are many women, what I've gathered from these interviews and from my client work is that there are many women who are really struggling with some of these side effects. And although it's not necessarily life-threatening to have debilitating panic attacks and to have depression or to have really painful sex, it really can interfere with your day-to-day life to the point that you really, really struggle with it. I've spoken to so many women for whom it became a huge issue, whether it be in her relationship. If she's having sexual difficulties, that can be really difficult to navigate, and that can certainly cause a lot of stress and put a lot of pressure on a relationship. And if you're experiencing anxiety or depression or panic attacks or those types of things, obviously that can make a really, really big difference in the quality of your day-to-day life. And so I will always, always err on the side of listening to and believing women. And certainly in my particular practice, the menstrual cycle is essential. It's the center of all of my client appointments. And so when I'm working with a woman and she's experiencing changes or disruptions or a variety of things that are happening that are showing up in her menstrual cycle, I don't have the luxury of telling her that it's in her head, because we can actually see the changes on her chart. We can see the cycle to cycle data, and we can really identify any of those shifts. And so I just don't have the luxury of telling women that their experiences aren't real or that they're not important or those types of things, because those experiences are central to everything that I do. So I hope that you take from this episode the importance of listening to women. And of course, if this episode really resonated with you and you can think of someone who would really benefit from hearing it, certainly you can share it, fertilityfriday.com/365. So with that said, I hope you have a wonderful weekend, whenever you're tuning into the show. And of course, as always, until next time, be well and happy charting.